HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents World War II at Sea, A Global History, by Craig L. Symonds. Read by Eric Martin. Author's Note. The Second World War was the single greatest cataclysm of violence in human history. Some 60 million people lost their lives, about 3% of the world's population. Thanks to scholars and memoirists of virtually every nation, it has been chronicled in thousands, even hundreds of thousands, of books in a score of languages. Many of those books document the naval aspects of the war. Unsurprisingly, the winners have been more fulsome than the vanquished. Stephen Roskell and Samuel Eliot Morison emphasized the particular contributions of the Royal Navy and the United States Navy in multi-volume sets. Others have examined the role of navies in a particular theater or a particular battle, especially in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. Yet, no single volume evaluates the impact of the sea services from all nations on the overall trajectory and even the outcome of the war. Doing so illuminates how profoundly the course of the war was charted and steered by maritime events. Such is the ambition of this work, and it is one with challenges. The story of the global war at sea between 1939 and 1945 is a sprawling, episodic, and constantly shifting tale of conflicting national interests, emerging technologies, and oversized personalities. Telling it in a single narrative is daunting, yet telling it any other way would be misleading. There was not one war in the Atlantic and another in the Pacific, a third in the Mediterranean, and still another in the Indian Ocean or the North Sea. While it might simplify things to chronicle the conflict in such geographical packets, that was not the way the war unfolded or the way decision-makers had to manage it. The loss of shipping during the Battle of the Atlantic affected the availability of transports for Guadalcanal. Convoys to the besieged island of Malta in the Mediterranean meant fewer escorts for the Atlantic. The pursuit of the battleship Bismarck drew forces from Iceland and Gibraltar, as well as from Britain. The narrative here, therefore, is chronological. Of course, leaping about from ocean to ocean day to day is both impractical and potentially bewildering, so there is necessarily some chronological overlap between chapters. Whenever possible, I allow the historical actors to speak for themselves, for my goal in this book is to tell the story of World War II at sea the way contemporaries experienced it, as a single, gigantic, complex story involving national leaders and strategic decision-makers, fleet commanders and ship drivers, motormechs, gunners, pilots, merchant seamen, and marines, as a worldwide human drama that had a disproportionate and lasting impact on the history of the world. Prologue. London, 1930. The murmur of conversation ceased abruptly, and there was a rustle of movement as the assembled delegates stood when King George entered the Royal Gallery, followed by the Lord Chamberlain and the Prime Minister. The king walked slowly but purposefully toward the ornate throne that dominated one end of the House of Lords, and he waited there while the delegates resettled themselves. That he was here at all was noteworthy, for George V had been ill for some time, very likely with the septicemia that would later kill him, and had retired to Cregwell House in Bognor on the Sussex coast to recuperate. Unhappy and frustrated by his confinement there, he had made a special effort to be present for this ceremony. The House of Lords, with its gilded coffered ceiling and stained glass windows, offered a suitable stage for the king's public reappearance, though the windows admitted little light on this occasion because on January 20th, 1930, London was blanketed by a thick fog. Local authorities had been compelled to turn on the streetlights in the middle of the day. The hall was crowded, not with peers of the realm, but with more than 100 delegates from 11 nations. 6 of those nations were dominions within Britain's far-flung empire, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, though the audience also boasted representatives from the military powers of 3 continents. From Europe, there were delegates from both France and Italy, though significantly not from either Weimar Germany or Communist Russia. In addition to Canada, a delegation from the United States represented the Western Hemisphere, and from Asia there was a substantial contingent from the Empire of Japan, though not from China. Each delegation was headed by a high-ranking civilian, and the audience included 2 prime ministers, 2 foreign secretaries, and 1 secretary of state. The men, and they were all men, were mostly in their 50s and 60s, and they constituted a somber audience in their dark suits with stiff white collars. Scattered among them, however, and lined up across the back of the hall, were the uniformed officers of a dozen navies, the fat and narrow gold stripes ascending their sleeves from cuff to elbow, revealing their exalted rank. There was less variation in their attire than might have been expected from such a polyglot assemblage, because all of them, including the Japanese, wore uniforms modeled on the Royal Navy prototype, a double-breasted dark blue, officially navy blue, coat with 2 vertical rows of gold buttons. Here was unmistakable evidence of the extent to which the Royal Navy was the archetype of all modern navies. Many of the officers also wore gaudy decorations, stars, and sashes, earned over a lifetime of service at sea and ashore, and the bright splashes of color among the dark suits suggested songbirds among ravens. Even the junior officers, tasked with note-taking, translating, and providing technical support, stood out by sporting thick aiguillettes of gold braid draped over their shoulders and across their chests, ornamentation that identified them as belonging to the staff of one or another of the gold-striped admirals. George V, too, might have worn a naval officer's uniform, since in addition to being the sovereign of Great Britain, Ireland, and British dominions beyond the seas, he was also a 5-star admiral in the Royal Navy. He had decided instead to wear a plain black frock coat. Solemnly he took his position in front of the distinguished audience to offer a brief welcoming address. Speaking in what the London Times called a firm and resonant voice, he noted that every nation there was proud of its navy, and rightly so. But, he said, competition among navies had been a major factor in provoking what he called the grim and immense tragedy that had erupted in 1914. He hardly had to remind these men that the battleship construction race between Britain and Imperial Germany from 1905 to 1914 had been a central feature of the mounting distrust that culminated in the outbreak of war. Indeed, in recognition of that, the victorious powers had met in Washington in 1921, a few years after the end of the war, to place limits on future battleship construction. Germany had not been invited to that conference, or to this one either, since the Versailles Treaty already forbade her both battleships and submarines. The Washington Conference had been a success, nonetheless, producing a treaty in 1922 that established limits on the size and number of battleships that could be possessed by the major powers, limits that were enshrined in the subsequently famous Formula 553, denoting the ratio of battleship tonnage allowed to Britain, the United States, and Japan, respectively, with France and Italy each accorded smaller totals. Now, the British monarch told the assembled delegates, it was time to go further and complete the job so nobly begun, to extend the limits to all classes of warships, cruisers, destroyers, and especially submarines. The impetus behind this renewed effort had 2 sources, one of them philosophical and idealistic, the other pragmatic and economic. The philosophical touchstone was the Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact, signed 2 years earlier by 62 nations, including all of those represented here. That agreement had outlawed war as an instrument of national policy. Years later, after regimes in Germany, Japan, and Italy had made a mockery of such high-principled declarations, it became popular to dismiss the Kellogg-Briand Pact as a fatuous exercise in wishful thinking. But in 1930, it was still being taken seriously, at least publicly. A more pragmatic spur to action was the fact that the previous October, a stock market crash in New York had triggered a worldwide economic recession, the depths of which had not yet been plumbed. With employment and revenue falling, governments the world over were seeking ways to trim their expenses, and warships were one of the most expensive items in any nation's budget. Additional naval arms limitation, therefore, seemed both philosophically admirable and fiscally responsible. In view of these circumstances, George V urged the delegates to lift the heavy burden of armaments now weighing upon the peoples of the world by finding a way to reduce warship construction. Battleships remained the universally accepted measuring stick of naval power, which was precisely why they had been the focus of the 1922 agreement. More than 600 feet long and displacing more than 30,000 tons of seawater, battleships were operated by crews of 12 to 1,500 men, making them virtual floating cities. Heavily armed as well as heavily armored, their principal weapon consisted of large-caliber guns housed in rotating turrets fore and aft. The largest of these guns had grown from a diameter of 12 inches to 14, and recently to 15 inches, and they fired shells that weighed nearly 2,000 pounds at targets 10 to 15 miles away. Indeed, the range of these massive guns was so great that most battleships carried airplanes that were used not only to scout for the enemy, but also to spot and report the fall of shot. These planes were propelled into the air by an explosive charge, and because they were equipped with pontoons, they could subsequently land alongside their host vessel and be winched back aboard. Battle cruisers were in some cases even longer than battleships, though they had slightly smaller guns and considerably less armor, which meant they displaced less tonnage. The largest warship in the Royal Navy in 1930 was the battle-cruiser HMS Hood, which at 860 feet was the pride of the fleet. While her 8 15-inch guns were the largest then afloat, her Achilles' heel was her relatively thin armor, which made her more vulnerable than any battleship. British battle-cruisers had fared badly in the 1916 Battle of Jutland, when 3 of them had blown up spectacularly with the loss of almost all hands. That had provoked Royal Navy Admiral David Beatty to comment, with characteristic British sang-froid, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." After that, most naval planners began to think of battle-cruisers not so much as light battleships as oversized cruisers. Cruisers looked much like battleships, with their characteristic superstructure amidships and rotating gun turrets fore and aft, and differed primarily in their smaller size. Heavy cruisers generally displaced about 10,000 tons, a third that of battleships, with guns that were 8 inches in diameter. Indeed, the Washington Treaty had specified that any ship displacing more than 10,000 tons or carrying a gun larger than 8 inches would count as a battleship, which led most nations to build heavy cruisers that conformed to those precise specifications. Light cruisers were smaller yet, usually displacing about 6,000 tons and carrying guns that fired 6-inch shells. The British preferred these smaller cruisers because they were cheaper, which meant they could build more of them to patrol the extensive sea lanes of their far-flung imperial possessions, from Gibraltar to Suez and from India to Singapore. Destroyers were the workhorses of 20th-century navies. Initially built to combat small torpedo boats, they were christened torpedo boat destroyers. If cruisers were about a third the size of battleships, destroyers were about a third the size of cruisers, displacing between 1,200 and 2,000 tons. Too small to slug it out with the bigger ships, they were generally used as escorts, scouting out ahead of the battleships to patrol for submarines, or performing that same function for merchant convoys. They had guns that varied in size from 4 to 5 inches, but their most effective anti-ship weapon was the torpedo. Though the reliability of the torpedoes was sometimes problematic, a destroyer armed with them could be fatal even to the largest of warships. The ostensible goal of the delegates in London was to extend the limits that had been applied to battleships in the 1922 treaty to cruisers and smaller ships as well, especially the heavy cruisers. The U.S. Navy's General Board had instructed its delegates that the United States needed no fewer than 27 of the big cruisers to ensure the security of its Pacific outposts at Hawaii, Wake, Guam, and the Philippines, though the board acknowledged confidentially that it could get by with 23. The British preferred to have fewer of the big cruisers and more of the smaller 6-inch gun cruisers. One difficulty, then, was to devise a formula by which some number of smaller cruisers could be equated to one heavy cruiser. Japan's case was unique. Back in 1922, Japan had reluctantly accepted the formula embedded in the Washington Treaty that allowed her only 3/5 of the battleship tonnage allotted to the Americans and the British. On one level, this was logical. The British and Americans had interests in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, as well as the Caribbean and the Mediterranean, and in Britain's case, the Indian Ocean, too. Japan's interests were almost exclusively in the Western Pacific, so her apparent subordination to the British and Americans actually gave her a strong relative position in her home waters. To the Japanese, however, it was a matter of national pride. Japanese newspapers remarked that the 553 Washington formula equated to Rolls-Royce, Rolls-Royce, Ford. The Japanese delegation had come to London with strict instructions to accept no less than 70% of the number of heavy cruisers allotted to Britain and the United States. As Kato Kanji, head of the Supreme Military Council, put it, "The real issue at stake is no longer our naval power per se, but our national prestige and credibility." In hindsight, it seems curious that so much effort and energy were focused on cruisers and so little on aircraft carriers. Such ships were less than a decade old in 1930, and the major naval powers continued to think of them as experimental ships that functioned as auxiliaries to battleships. The British suggested that perhaps they and the United States could each accept a limit of 100,000 tons of carriers, but American delegates nixed that proposal, in part because 2 of the existing American carriers, Lexington and Saratoga, displaced more than 36,000 tons each and would use up more than 2/3 of the total allotment, leaving little room for experimentation. Nor was there any substantive agreement about submarines, the unrestricted use of which had nearly brought England to her knees in the last war, and which had played a major role in triggering American belligerency in 1917. Given that, it was not surprising that during the ensuing conversations, both the Americans and the British urged the abolition of submarines altogether. Like germ warfare and gas warfare, submarine warfare would be banned entirely. Henry Stimson, the Secretary of State, who headed the U.S. delegation, declared that the use of the submarine revolted the conscience of the world, and noted presciently that, regardless of any international rules that might be adopted for their use, those who employ the submarine will be under strong temptation, perhaps irresistible temptation, to use it in the way which is most effective for immediate purposes, which was the destruction of unarmed merchant ships. Italy and France, however, rejected that argument. They insisted that submarines were defensive craft, invaluable to weaker naval powers, and that abolishing them would only increase the naval dominance of the English-speaking superpowers. The French Minister of Marine, Georges Leguet, argued that it was not the submarine itself that was evil, but the way it was used. Noting that airplanes could be used to bomb cities, he asked if they should be banned because they were capable of such acts. In the end, the only limit that all of the delegates could agree to was that individual submarines would be limited to no more than 2,000 tons displacement. Since most submarines displaced less than half that, this was, in effect, no limit at all. The delegates did adopt new rules for the humane use of submarines. Captains were to provide their victims with sufficient time to abandon ship and get well away before attacking. Of course, since such rules were unenforceable, they were also largely meaningless. In all these discussions, the unseen and unacknowledged spectre was Germany. This was especially true for the French, who had been invaded twice by Germany within the lifetime of the French delegates in the room. There was no German delegation in London because the Versailles Treaty already detailed the size and type of navy that Germany was allowed to have, so what was there to discuss? The Kaiserliche Marine, the old imperial navy, no longer existed. In October 1918, with the war virtually lost, the commander of Germany's battleship fleet, Admiral Reinhard Scheer, had ordered it to sea, presumably to engage in one last sacrificial battle for the sake of honor. The sailors refused to do it, some of them raising the red flag of the Bolsheviks in open rebellion. Consequently, when the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the German fleet was still at anchor at Wilhelmshaven, the principal German naval base on the southern rim of the North Sea, between Holland and Denmark. During the negotiations at Versailles, that fleet steamed under skeleton crews to intern itself at the Royal Navy's roadstead at Scapa Flow, north of Scotland. When it became evident that the British intended to demand those ships as spoils of war, the German crews scuttled them, opening the sea cocks below decks and sending them to the bottom of the chilly waters of Scapa Flow. 11 years later, as the delegates met in London, they were there still, as they are today. That did not stop the French from worrying about a German revival. If France was expected to weaken her defenses in any way, by giving up her submarines, for example, the French government wanted a commitment from the British and the Americans that they would come to her aid, or at least consult with her, if she was attacked again. Given their tradition of insularity, the British were unwilling to make such a guarantee, and the Americans, firmly entrenched in a policy of isolationism, adamantly refused. The biggest stumbling block at the conference concerned the Japanese. The Japanese were determined to secure no less than 70% of the number of heavy cruisers allocated to the British and Americans, who in turn were just as determined to hold the percentage at 60%. In the end, a somewhat complicated compromise allocated the Americans 18 heavy cruisers and the Japanese 12, 66%. While this seemed a middle ground position, it was complicated by other factors. One was that the Japanese already had 12 such cruisers, and the Americans had only 4. The practical effect of the agreement, then, was that the Americans could build 14 new heavy cruisers, while the Japanese total was frozen at 12. On the other hand, the Japanese would be allowed to replace their existing cruisers with new ones over the ensuing 5 years, while the Americans could not build the last of their new cruisers until 1935. The overall effect was that the Japanese would actually possess a de facto cruiser ratio of near 70% for the life of the treaty. In consideration of these factors, and unwilling to let the conference collapse, the head of the Japanese delegation, former Prime Minister Reijiro Wakatsuki, accepted the compromise. That infuriated most of the Japanese naval officers who had accompanied the delegation, especially the younger officers, who denounced Wakatsuki to his face. Back in Tokyo, however, the sitting prime minister and, crucially, the emperor supported the arrangement, and the treaty was ratified. On the final day of the conference, Wakatsuki rose to thank the British for their hospitality and to offer some concluding remarks. He knew full well that, despite the incremental gains he had secured, the treaty would be unpopular with the Imperial Japanese Navy, as the reaction of the officer delegates had already demonstrated, and that it was possible, perhaps even likely, that he would lose his position, or even his life, in consequence. He nevertheless praised the agreement as a historic and lasting monument on the path of peace and human progress. The Germans, of course, had no opportunity to say anything at all. The new agreement offered no easing of the strangling restrictions that the victors of the Great War had imposed on the German Navy, and German resentment at the Versailles humiliation continued to rankle. In national elections held 5 months later, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi for short, won 18.3% of the popular vote and 107 seats in the Reichstag, making it the second-largest political party in Germany. Part 1. The European War. Adolf Hitler assumed power in Germany less than 3 years after the signing of the London Agreement. He did not seize power violently, as he had tried to do back in 1924. He was invited to become Chancellor by virtue of the Nazi Party's success at the polls. Hitler then consolidated his power in a series of emergency decrees, and the Weimar government effectively disappeared. 2 years later, in March 1935, Hitler publicly renounced the Versailles Treaty, including the restrictions it imposed on the size of the German Navy. There were no repercussions in his unilateral announcement, and Hitler was confirmed in his view of the fecklessness of the Western democracies. The renunciation of the Versailles Treaty was important, but the decisive moment in the rebirth of the German Navy came 3 months later with the signing of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. By then, many in Britain actively sought an accommodation with Germany. British diplomats saw Hitler's regime as a useful buffer to Stalinist Russia and welcomed the idea of an Anglo-German rapprochement. On June 18, 1935, without consulting either France or Italy, Britain agreed to lift most of the naval restrictions that had been imposed on Germany at Versailles. The new agreement permitted Germany to build a navy whose total tonnage was 35% that of the Royal Navy. While that would keep it subordinate to the British, it also opened the door for substantial new growth. The treaty even allowed for the construction of the first German submarines since 1918. By its terms, Germany could build its submarine force up to 45% of the British total, and there was an escape clause that allowed Germany to build up to 100% of Britain's total in the event of a national crisis, though what kind of crisis might justify such an expansion was not stipulated. The German Navy also got a new name. Under the old empire, it had been the Kaiserliche Marine, Imperial Navy. During the Weimar Republic, it was the Reichsmarine, National Navy. Now, under Hitler, it became the Kriegsmarine, War Navy. On September 1, 1939, Hitler's revitalized German army, the Wehrmacht, invaded Poland. The naval war began the same day when a German warship opened fire on the Polish garrison of Gdansk, Danzig. 2 days later, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain went on the radio to announce that since he had received no response to the Anglo-French ultimatum calling on Hitler to withdraw German forces from Poland, a state of war now existed between Britain and Germany. The lugubrious tone of his announcement underscored the reality that almost everyone in the British government, and in the British public for that matter, dreaded the resumption of hostilities. Chamberlain had labored mightily to prevent war, and he had failed, largely because he had underestimated both the breadth of Hitler's ambition and the perversity of his ideology. So now, barely 20 years after the last war had ended, war had come again. Chapter 1. Unterseeboten. The North Sea was rough in October 1939, as it often was in the fall months, especially this far north. Strong winds whipped froth from the crest of the dark waves and turned it into a stinging spray that drenched the three men who stood precariously on the small conning tower of the actively rolling submarine U-47, wetting them thoroughly despite their oilskins. One of those men was the sub's captain, 31-year-old Gunther Prinz.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?